Okay, everybody, we're continuing our study of Gospel according to Mark, and we had just begun
Are you asking me to move, Jim?
doing our verse-by-verse commentary last week in chapter 1, and we got all the way up through verse 13. There are two things I want to remind you of as we approach these texts, or this particular text of Mark's Gospel. Number one, always keep in mind who the author is, John Mark. That's really important because that explains a lot of what he is doing in this literary work. The second thing to keep in mind, which is just as important, is the audience of Mark. And it is generally believed by the majority of biblical scholars that he is writing to a community that's under duress, and serious duress. They're being persecuted. And so the tradition that comes down to us, which most scholars are coming to agree that there's accuracy, is that this was produced or written down during the first major imperial persecution of the Christian community, which only occurred in the city of Rome. And it was by Nero. And it is believed that during this persecution is when both Peter and Paul were martyred, along with scores of other early Christians. And it was brutal and it was violent. So that's the audience he's writing to. And it helps us, it does illuminate some of the passages that are unique to Mark that we will see. And I'll make observations for you, and there will be things that you will see. I just will be running on doing commentary, but I'm really happy to have contributions, as you know, from you, because I don't see everything in the text, and you might see something or have something strike you. So don't even hesitate to make a contribution, or ask a question, or if there's something that you've seen that you thought was rather interesting in the text itself. So we're looking at this and we're progressing together. With those two things in mind, we're looking at the first chapter, and remember the first verse really is the title of the work. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we talked a little bit about what Son of God meant. As Mark is using it, it's not a title of divinity. It's a royal title that belongs to the Davidic dynasty. So when Jesus is called the Son of God in Mark's Gospel, it's referring to his royalty as the heir to the throne of David. Remember, when he was crucified, according to Mark's account, is that the crime that's usually posted above the head of the crucified victim, in this case, it was just said that this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. So that could have been done in mockery, or it was Pilate's decision. We learn elsewhere why he did that. So that was the charge brought against Jesus. And so you can see that the imperial power was sending a message to the whole Jewish nation. This is what happens to someone who claims to be the king of the Jews, apart from the emperor. And so it's a political statement. Yes, Liz?
Can you tell me what exactly I-N-R-I? I know R was Ray, maybe an owl of Israelites, but the I-N is...
I is, that's a Latin thing, but the I is for the name Jesus, Jesus. In Greek, it is Jesus, or Jesus, and then I in Nazareth, N's for Nazareth, and then R, King, and then I, Judah. King of the Jews. So that stands for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But that's a good point, because we see it depicted in art that way. It was probably written out fully, and probably was written in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic. That's probably what they had posted, so that everyone would know why he's dying. What's really interesting, and the reason I bring up the crucifixion at this point, is because Mark begins the gospel by making the statement, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. At his death, this is a very prominent statement made by the Roman centurion. Surely he was the Son of God. And in Mark's use of that, Mark, what the centurion was recognizing with this guy, he saw the courage and what the suffering Jesus went through, and he was so impressed that the Roman centurion makes this confession, which is, again, not a confession of divinity, it's a confession of his royalty. Now, the Son of Man is used much more frequently in Mark's Gospel than the Son of God. And the reason that is because Jesus, that's the title he used to refer to himself as the Son of Man. The background for that title is the book of the prophet Daniel, and the Son of Man is a divine title. It points to his divinity. Son of God points to his royalty, his humanity. And Son of Man points to his divinity. It's a divine being. So that it's kind of counterintuitive, because I used to think Son of God referred to his divinity and Son of Man referred to his humanity. But that's not the case with Mark. It's actually the opposite in this gospel. So we made that comment about the first verse. And then there is what we call the prologue of his gospel. And the other four gospel writers follow this pattern. It begins by talking about the emergence on the stage of the forerunner of Jesus, and that is John the Baptist. So we talked about John the Baptist and his preaching. Remember that the people of Israel in the first century were longing for God to speak to them again, and they were longing to hear from a prophet, and it had been nearly 3 centuries since there was a prophet in Israel. So when John the Baptist comes on the scene with his powerful preaching, it electrified the population of Israel, and they recognized him as being a prophet. This was really powerful stuff if you were a Jew living in the first century in Palestine. So people came out from all over to see him. There was such a movement, a people movement with John the Baptist. He was not an obscure person that only a few people knew, you know, like Peter Hickman at St. Matthew's. You know, his fame was so well known that he's mentioned in the great historical work by a man by the name of Josephus, who worked for the Romans, but he was a Jew, and he wrote a history. And in this history, he devotes quite a bit of time talking about John the Baptist. And I think I'll get that for you, that text, so you can see what Josephus says next week. I think that would be interesting for you to see. He devotes more space and more text or narrative to John the Baptist than he does even Jesus. That's how well known John the Baptist was. So he made a great impression upon his generation. And in case you were not sure he was a prophet or not, look how he dressed himself. He dresses himself in camel's hair. You know how Mark makes a point of telling you what the wardrobe is? He doesn't do that for very many people, so he has a purpose for doing that. He had a tunic made from camel's hair, and he had a leather belt around his waist. So John the Baptist chose this particular wardrobe to help people identify him as a prophet, because that's what the prophet Elijah wore. It's even recorded in the book of Kings that Elijah dressed in this way. So he was wearing the unmistakable vestment of a prophet. Another thing we observed last week was that John the Baptist, although he was steeped in the tradition of the Nevi'im, the Hebrew prophets, that he also, now Mark doesn't tell us this, but we know from Luke that John the Baptist was in fact a priest. He didn't practice as a priest at the temple, but he was a priest by heredity, because the priesthood was passed down from father and son, and his father, Zacharias, was a priest who ministered in the temple at Jerusalem itself. So even though John the Baptist is never shown ministering in the temple as a priest, in fact, that is his heritage. This helps explain to us his use of baptism. Baptism is not normally never was really used by prophets. That's uncharacteristic of prophets, but it was used by the priesthood. Ablutions, ritual bathings were common in the temple, and not only that, but the Essenes, who were Jews who rejected the temple authority because it was so corrupt, they formed their own communities around the Dead Sea. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls come from them, that were discovered in an area called Qumran, and it is believed that John the Baptist, who grew up in the wilderness of Judea, that would put him right there with the Essenes, was certainly aware of them, if not a part of them at one time. And they practiced ritual bathings. They were big into ritual washings, and so John the Baptist would have been influenced by the Essenes, by his heritage as a priest, and so baptism now becomes a natural sign. He takes baptism, a purification rite, and he uses it with a new prophetic spin. He gives it new meaning. Jesus will take the baptism of John and give it new meaning, different than that of John. John's purpose for the ritual bath of baptism was so that people would be ritually purified, that they would be cleansed of their sins. It symbolized that, so that they were ready for the coming of the Messiah, or the Divine One. So this is all a foreshadowing of the coming of Jesus. So that's pretty much the ministry of John the Baptist. And then finally, it's not until verse 9 that we get Jesus emerging on the stage. In verse 9, it happened in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan River by John. So now Jesus comes on the scene. We've already been introduced to John. Now we're introduced to the person of Jesus. And Jesus is then baptized by the prophet John. But the baptism of Jesus was quite unlike anyone else's baptism, because there was a tremendous spiritual experience that Jesus had at the moment of his baptism. He has a vision of heaven. Now, in Mark's gospel, which is different than Matthew and Luke, the vision seems to be something only Jesus experienced. John makes no reference to anyone else seeing this vision. In Mark's gospel, it's Jesus who is having this vision, and the voice is speaking to Jesus. The dove of the Spirit descends upon him in his baptism, in this vision. And heaven is parted, and he sees the glory of heaven, and then the voice comes out of heaven is of God the Father saying, you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So he's speaking to Jesus. In Luke's gospel, in Matthew's gospel, the voice says, this is my beloved Son, as if God is now speaking to the witnesses that are standing around during the baptism. So I think it's interesting. Mark's take is a little bit different. And remember, he is the original gospel. Matthew and Luke copy him and make alterations to serve their purposes. Okay, and then after he is there in the experiencing the baptism, he comes to the part, and this is where we left off last week, that he is cast into the wilderness, or driven into the wilderness for the temptation. Now, we're familiar with the temptation of Christ from Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, where the devil comes to him and talks to him, and there's 3 temptations. That's missing in Mark. That's not there. So Matthew and Luke got that from another source and brought it into their gospels. But Mark just says he was out there being tempted by the devil. Yes, Adelia.
How do we know that Jesus was tempted? Just by what was written? Because did Jesus tell Mark, Matthew, or Luke? I mean, how do they know this? I'm very skeptical about the temptation of Jesus. I've always been. Because I can't believe that Satan would show up and start bugging Jesus. I just can't believe that.
Yeah.
Because, it's like, oh my God. Because Satan knows who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And so it's like, why would that have happened? I mean, I just, it's really hard for me. So, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to look and expand my thinking. How does Mark know that Jesus, because he was alone? And
Yeah,
did
how
Mark
did-
like follow him around and hide behind cactus and rocks, or?
Yeah, well, obviously there was no one there observing Jesus going into the wilderness for this long period of time in which he is tempted by the devil or tested by the devil. What we have, rather, is a story that probably somehow came from Jesus himself. Otherwise, they're making it up.
And
So-
theologically, if we were to look at this, what would have been the point of Jesus being tempted? Good, Diane
Yeah.
knows the answer.
Yeah.
Of course
That's
she
great.
does. I want to hear it.
Yeah, this is a good conversation. We'll continue. Yes, Diane?
Well, I was going to wait until we got him back in Galilee, but I'll offer this now. I'd like for, this is for you. I want to go back to verse 10. On coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens being torn open, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. Matthew and Luke use the heavens were opened. Now, if you say the heavens were opened, that implies that they could be closed again. Okay? But in Mark, the heavens are torn open, ripped open.
Almost like violent.
Violence, there's a suggestive of violence. And the idea here is that now divinity has come into the human world and can't be taken away from it. You can't undo what has now happened. I mean, and that's part of the violence with which this breach has occurred. So now divinity comes down into the world. But not only do we get the divinity of Jesus being expressed in this, the demons come too. Satan comes too, from the realm of the divine into the human world. And all of Mark, in many, many ways, is this battle between Satan and Jesus. You know, and the demons, now that the demons are among us, the demons know who he is, right? We've got all these passages that Bishop Peter passed out. The demons know who he is. Ordinary people haven't figured out. Certainly his disciples are clueless. They don't know who he is, but the demons know who he is. And at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, if you go to the crucifixion, the curtain of the temple is torn. Mark uses exactly the same word, is torn open, so that what had only been the purview of the high priest to go in and be with God in the Holy of Holies, now that comes into the whole of the world. I mean, it's very clear to me that there's, it's a very symbolic theological statement that's being made here. And so the idea that now the Spirit drives him out, and he's got to, he is tempted. He's not overcome by Satan, but he's tempted out there in the desert by Satan in Mark. Does that help?
Well, I that's good. I love that. I like, a single word that can express something. That's really powerful, so I'm willing to be open-minded about it and want to learn. And so,
Well,
there you have it.
I think we have to remember that this is not a court reporter's account of what's going on, and that there is a theology undergirding what is important to Mark, and especially within the context of this community in Rome that is under siege.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard?
Any thoughts about how it might be a one-on-one temptation as Eve had,
Oh, yeah.
and now Jesus in our place is having it, being the second Adam?
Yeah, I don't know if that was in Mark's mind, but clearly that was something that was in Luke and Matthew's account, I think, because in Mark's account, the devil doesn't speak. It's just said that he went out was tempted by the devil. But in Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, I think they very much had the garden temptation in mind when and so Eve and the first man were tempted by the talking serpent, the devil, in the paradise of a garden. Jesus now is in a desert wilderness, a place devoid of life. It's not a paradise, and now the same devil is there, seeking to tempt him. So yeah, I think that's a great observation.
Yeah, I've thought of that too. That's good. That's really good. And so, I mean, I've thought about this in the past. I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, for some reason, I was dealing with this, and I never concluded anything. So I'm glad we're talking about it now. I mean, and I don't know if I'll conclude anything again, but at
Yeah.
least I want to talk about it, and I haven't had anybody really, this is great. I have a whole group of people to talk about it with.
Well, I'm glad you're here. We can have this conversation. Now, I'll say this. Yeah, Paul.
I just want to know that second version of the temptation. Is that the one that involved the loaf of bread and
Yes.
turn yourself up?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the temptation story that is told by Luke and Mark, they say this, but they say more. It's more elaborated. And you have the devil actually coming, speaking to Jesus, and there's this dialogue between the devil and Jesus, and the devil is putting Jesus to the test, and there's 3 classic temptations there. This is not in Mark's gospel, so that's a difference. Another thing to recognize that I think Mother Diane was touching on this, is that Mark uses very violent language in his gospel. You'll see this again and again. It's the most dynamic gospel of all 4 of them. For example, the heavens being torn open. Boy, that's an image. The image I have is that the fabric of space and time is just ripped open and you're seeing eternity. Whereas in Luke and Matthew's gospel, as Diane pointed out, it just simply says the heavens opened and the Holy Spirit came. This also shows up in the temptation. For in verse 12 it says, in the temptation, at once the Spirit drove Jesus out. And drove is actually a soft translation. Literally in the Greek, and I think I mentioned this before, the word is ekbalo. Jesus is cast into the wilderness. It'd be like if I took Father Richard here and grabbed him by the collar and by the belt of his pants and lifted him up with my super strength and just tossed him into the desert. That's the image there. Jesus was like compelled to go in the desert. He had no choice. He was thrown out into the desert wilderness. But in Matthew's gospel, it says, and Jesus, I can't remember, Luke's gospel, I think Jesus was led out by the Spirit.
Matthew was led by the Spirit into the wilderness.
Yeah, you almost get it like the Spirit was taking him by the hand and gently bringing him to the, see, Luke and Matthew tend to soften the harsh language of Mark. Now, why is violent, vivid language used in Mark? Why would you think he would use that kind of language? Yeah, Richard.
The soldiers might be coming and grabbing you as a Christian and taking you to the judgment or prison or whatever. Just violently.
Do you see where Richard went? He went right to the audience. The audience that is being written to, they were being besieged. They were experiencing violence. And so this may explain why Mark uses such harsh, combative, dynamic language. I think that's wonderful.
Because in a way, it was like comforting, perhaps.
Yeah, because Jesus went through what we're going through. Because, well, I want to say something here at this point. The story of Jesus having this spiritual experience, having a vision, that's huge. And he's being affirmed. God the Father's affirming his identity to him. This is a heady moment for Jesus. Never forget that he's fully human. We sometimes lose sight of that. We forget his humanity because we emphasize his divinity. But Jesus struggled with all the limitations of humanity. And so this was a defining moment he had. It's what we would call a mountaintop experience. You ever had a great spiritual experience and you're like, you've had it, majority of it. So, I mean, you're just like there. And then what happens after you have a mountaintop experience? You crash. You crash and you're like depressed and you're in the valley and you wonder how I got here. I was feeling so, God seems far away. And so it's not surprising that Jesus has this high spiritual experience at his baptism. He's thrown into the wilderness by the Spirit, cast into the wilderness, and now he's crashed, and now he's at the bottom in the valley, the desert experience, and now it's not the Holy Spirit and God the Father who is manifesting, it's the devil. And the devil begins by playing upon the doubts of the human Jesus. Remember, each temptation in Matthew's Gospels is prefaced by the words, if you are the Son of God, because there might be some doubt about that. You just may be going nuts thinking you're God, or divine, or the Son of God. So, this journey from the defining spiritual experience down through the valley of temptation is what is called in literature, particularly Western literature, the hero's journey. And you see this theme again and again. And the one time I saw this in modern mythology is when I went to see The Empire Strikes Back. The Star Wars trilogy, it's the second one. I think it was The Empire Strikes Back. And Luke Skywalker is the hero. He's on a journey. And he had this great experience where he destroyed the Death Star in the first movie. Now he has to go out to this planet in the wilderness and meet his teacher. And who's his teacher? Yoda. And then Yoda then said, after training him and teaching him, says, now it's time for you to go out. So he goes out and he enters this cave. Remember that? And he goes down in this deep, dark cave. It's really foreboding. And then when he gets into the cave, he encounters his nemesis, who is the personification of evil. And it's Darth Vader in the cave. And then he struggles with Darth Vader. Darth Vader collapses. And his mask comes off. And whose face is it? It's Luke Skywalker's face. See, the struggle with the self. The struggle about who I am and what my mission is. So that's called the hero's journey. And you see it in mythology and a lot of other literature. And here, lo and behold, it's the theme in the gospel. Jesus is on his hero's journey. He had to go through this testing in order to do perform his mission. Now, in the temptation as recorded for us by Mark, only says two things. He was in the desert for 40 days and he was tempted by Satan. Then, this very peculiar line, he was among the wild beasts and the angels ministered to him. What were happening to the audience in Rome? They were being thrown to what? Wild beasts. They were being tested. They were being thrown into the clutches of the devil. So this being thrown to the wild beast is a comforting thing because Jesus was among the wild beasts. Just like they were being thrown into the arena. But also there is a promise there. Angels ministered to him, which would say to the listener, even if you're thrown into the arena, there will be angels that will minister to you. You see how this reflects, knowing who the audience is, informs us as to why Mark writes the way he writes. Isn't that exciting? Okay.
I had something
Yes,
I wanted to
Sharon, yeah.
One of the things that became really clear to me is that there's got to be a context because when he starts performing these miracles, a lot of them are casting out demons.
Yeah,
So this prepares you for what's about to come.
yeah. I think that's precisely what Mark has in mind here. So now he emerges he's had this great spiritual experience of the baptism. He had the journey into the desert where he struggled with the devil and he overcame the devil in the struggle within himself. Then he begins his ministry. And this is how it begins. Anyone have any comments so far? Yes.
I just wanted to throw out that, assuming that Matthew and Luke did have a copy of Mark's gospel, they omit the comment about the wild beasts. It's
And the
not-
angels.
And the angels. That's
It's not there.
not there. So their context is quite different than the context that we're facing the people that are reading this gospel.
Yeah. The Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke were written within communities that were not experiencing duress and persecution. But you certainly see that in Mark's Gospel, and you see the internal evidence. So this affirms what tradition has told us about the circumstances of the production of Mark. So after John had been arrested, so there's mention here that John the Baptist was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. Gospel is euangelion. It means the glad tidings, the good announcement. And it's an ancient word that would have been used of a messenger who would run from the battle to the city to say, we won. We won the battle. So Jesus is now proclaiming this good news of the coming of the kingdom of God. This is the time of fulfillment, Jesus says. The kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. The kingdom is not referring to a geographic location in the mind of Jesus here. Even though we think of the kingdom like the United Kingdom or the kingdom of Sweden or something like that, that's not what they're thinking. They're not thinking of a geographical thing. It is literally the rule of God, the reign of God. The reign of God has come. It's at hand. This is the moment of fulfillment. And then he says, repent, which is that word metanoia. Which really literally means, thanks to Mother Diana's insight, to change your mind. Change your thinking. It also means turn around. You're going the wrong way, go back a different direction. I like them. Oh yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I looked it up last time and it said also, change the way you do things.
Yeah, it does have. When the Greeks use the word, they're thinking of how you're thinking, because the Greeks were very much about the intellect and the mind. But when Aramaic Jews use the word, they're thinking more about behavior, action. So you have to balance those two off to get a clear idea of what the author is saying. But unfortunately, we translate that do penance or repent, and we get all caught up in a legalistic understanding of what is a sin, what's not a sin, not doing sin, and I think that so much is lost when we get into that particular paradigm, which is more of a medieval paradigm. But it's about radical change. It's about transformation. It begins in the mind. You change your mind, but it also reflects in your behavior. There was a movie I saw called Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. You like that movie?
Yeah.
This is a great illustration of how metanoia may be used. Do you remember John Candy and who was the other actor?
Steve Martin.
Steve Martin. They're going down the highway at high speed, and Steve Martin is in the passenger seat and he falls asleep. And John Candy is driving, but he's getting too hot. He has this like down jacket on, and then he's trying to remove it. Ever try to remove a jacket when you're driving? Well, he puts one arm behind, and it gets stuck. He puts the other arm around, it's stuck. Now, his hands are around the guy, and he's going fast. Well, he loses control of the car, and it spins and spins. It goes off an off-ramp, and it stops. Miraculously, nothing happened. And at this point, Steve Martin wakes up. Whoa, what's wrong? Why'd we stop? And he says, no problem. And then John Candy drives back on the freeway. But he is so confused, he lost his sense of direction, that he's now going down the freeway at a high speed, but he's on the wrong side of the road. And so as he's going there, you know how they have the divided highways in the Midwest? They have the divided highway there, and he's driving down there, and he sees someone on the other side who is driving the same direction he is. But they're on the other side. And the people who were in the car driving, it's a couple, they're thinking, that person over there is going the wrong way. So they roll down the window and they're screaming at him, you're going the wrong way, turn around. And in the meantime, there are two semi-trucks coming towards John Candy. He doesn't notice it, but we, the viewer, see these trucks. They're right next to each other, and he's headed for disaster. And the people on the other side of the road who are going the correct way notice that what's going on here, and they're trying to warn John Candy, turn around, turn around. And he starts waving to them. He thinks they're just being friendly. And then he turns and he looks and he sees these two semi-trucks with their big headlights coming right at him. You have to get the movie if you want to see what happens. He didn't turn around and it was a disaster, I'll put it that way. Okay, so repent, change your mind, turn around. Okay, verse 16. So, he gets into the calling of the first disciples. So he's on the Sea of Galilee. As he passed by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon. You know who that is. That's Peter. He'll be called Peter later. And his brother Andrew casting their nets into the sea. They were fishermen. Jesus said to them, come after me, and I will make you fishers of men. Then they abandoned their nets and followed him. There must have been something so compelling about Jesus that he could have that effect. And they abandoned nets, followed him. Verse 19, he walked along a little farther and saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. So James was the elder. John was the younger brother. They too were in a boat mending their nets. Then he called to them. So they left their father Zebedee in the boat along with the hired men and followed him. Very simply stated. In Luke's gospel, it's much more elaborate. But this is simply stated by the writer Mark. Now, tradition tells us that Mark's gospel really is a reflection of Peter's memory. That Mark was the one who was interpreting Peter as he told these stories. So Peter is the great apostle behind the Gospel of Mark. So this is perhaps his memory. Then the very first thing that happens, the very first miracle Jesus performs in the Gospel of Mark. Now we always say, what was the first miracle Jesus ever performed?
Water.
Right, the wedding at Cana in Galilee. That happens in John's Gospel. No mention of that in Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel, the very first miracle Jesus performs is an exorcism. Isn't that shocking? We never say the first miracle of Jesus was an exorcism, because that's weird stuff. But I want to give you, call your attention. Did I already give this to you?
Yes.
Binding the strong man. Look at this carefully. I quote a verse from Mark's Gospel, actually from the 5th chapter. No one can enter a strong man's house to plunder his property unless he first ties up the strong man or binds the strong man. That's what that means. Jesus is referring to his ministry of exorcism when he says that. The reason he's able to cast out demons is because he's bound. He's binding Satan. The struggle between Satan and the kingdom of God, and the battle between Satan and Jesus. So, we see this throughout Mark. We're going to read the story of the demoniac in the synagogue of Capernaum. The first miracle recorded by Jesus, of Jesus, recorded in the Gospel according to Mark. Now, so many of us have been influenced by the movie The Exorcist, and with all the special effects and the weirdness, and it was very supernatural and all that kind of thing. And so it's hard for us to get away from that popular notion. I want you to realize that this was like Sunday morning at Mass. Jesus is in the synagogue. All the people of Capernaum are going there. It's their habit to go to synagogue. So the demoniac, or the person who had the demon, was just another normal person in the community. He wasn't drooling, his head wasn't twisted, he wasn't discolored. People didn't know he was demon-possessed. He might have not even known he was demon-possessed. But so it's a normal church-going crowd there at the synagogue of Capernaum. And the synagogue of Capernaum is about the size of our church chapel. I know that because I was there. I mean, I wasn't there in the first century, but I went over to Israel, and the same stone floor that is there to this day is the same stone floor that Jesus would have walked upon. Did you go to Israel, Jean?
I didn't. I wanted to.
Oh, we gotta go. We all just gotta make up our minds and go to Israel. But anyway, so Jesus goes to the synagogue, and read how Mark puts it here. Then they came to Capernaum. And note that it's on a Sabbath, which would have been Friday evening at sundown. On Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and he taught, which means that he was already recognized as having a certain amount of expertise for him to be able to teach publicly. So Jesus was a learned man. How he became learned, we do not know. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now, the scribes would always say, Rabbi so-and-so said this, another rabbi said this, another authority said that. Kind of like what I do, you know. But Jesus didn't do that. He just spoke from his own authority. And that startled him. That was different than what the scribes and the scholars of the Hebrew scriptures would do. But in Mark's gospel, his authority is not so much in what he is saying as to what he is doing. Jesus in Mark's gospel is not only teaching by spoken word, he's teaching by exercising his authority in action. And now you're about to see it in this first miracle. So he taught as one having authority. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit. Impure spirit, evil spirit, demon. They all mean the same thing. And all of a sudden this man cries out. But it's not the man. It is the unclean spirit that is speaking through the man. The man may not have ever been conscious that he had a demon, and others may not have been aware of it. And so he cries out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." It's like the demon is commending Jesus. So what does Jesus do? He rebukes him. Quiet. You know, this is such a soft English translation. Oh, please be quiet. Come out of it. No, this is an exercise of authority. It would be the equivalent of saying, "Be silent! Come out of it!" That's really the tension that is here in the drama. And then the unclean spirit convulsed the man, and with a loud cry came out of him. What's the reaction of the crowd? All were amazed. All were amazed and asked one another, what is this? A new teaching. With authority, he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Shocking, isn't it? His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. Now, what I've done for you here in this sheet that I gave you tonight, Finding the Strong Man, is to give you each account of an exorcism that takes place in Mark's Gospel. So it's spread out through Mark's Gospel, and also there are general statements that he cast out many demons without telling a specific story and healed many who were sick. So it's hard for us to imagine as moderns, but one of the characteristics of the ministry of Jesus was that he was an exorcist. We don't think of that. We like Jesus as the wise teacher, the nice healer, but the exorcist, it just gets bizarre, but this is really true. And exorcism was not unheard of in the ancient world. Both the pagans and the Jews dealt with people who they felt were influenced by a foreign or alien spirit. They didn't know what the alien spirit was, but they would perform different ritual actions. Jesus, too, was an exorcist. The only thing about Jesus that astonished people is that he was very effective at it. It wasn't the fact that he was an exorcist that set him aside. There were other exorcists, but he was just so good at it, and he did it instantly. Where in the ancient world, exorcisms would take hours, if not days, of ritual praying and whatever they would do to try to expel a demon. Yes, probably.
So these were not spirits that could be seen.
No.
They could just tell from the person's demeanor that
Somehow it was manifested. Yeah. There is an exorcism that takes place in Mark chapter 5, which gives us a more vivid explanation of what people saw when they saw a demon-possessed person. This doesn't give us too much of a description in this text. So there are certain things that people would associate with demonic manifestation. And I'm quite sure in the ancient world they attributed demonic possession for things that might have been ordinary illnesses because they didn't know. You know? But in this particular case, they're identifying this as a demon. Jesus responds as an exorcist. So what amazed people is that Jesus could perform an exorcism effortlessly. He just said, be quiet and get out of here. And they're gone. No one had ever seen that kind of thing. Exorcism was a long process to deliver someone from an evil spirit in the days of the first century. Are you having a good time?
yeah.
So there was a time when I was a young man, went to seminary, went to graduate school, and I became very sophisticated. And I thought, oh, I don't believe this stuff, this is the way the ancients thought of normal mental illness. And so I was skeptical. And in a lot of cases, that could be what the ancients would do, is attribute things that we can diagnose. But in my pastoral experience, I've run into a couple of situations in which I learned otherwise. So based on my own experience, not that this is frequent, not that it's like the movie The Exorcist, but I have seen certain things that convince me that there is this reality. It's nothing to be messed with, but it caused me to reconsider. And someday I will tell you a couple of stories, but now you want me to tell you tonight.
You started it.
Okay. You want me to tell you an exorcism story?
Sure.
Sure,
Okay.
let's hear it.
That convinced me. Well, here, I'll try to make this narrative as brief as possible without leaving out any of the important details. Early on in my pastoral ministry here at St. Matthew's, I got a call from a member of our church, and he said, he called me and he says, Father, my wife and I, we have to come down and see you. We need to see you. I said, well, we can make an appointment maybe tomorrow evening. He said, oh no, we got to come down now. And I said, oh, well, of course, come on down. So they came down to see me, and this couple began to tell me, and this couple, they looked really distressed. And I knew this couple because they had been coming to our church for a couple of years. And so they were very distressed. They came to my office, and I said, what's going on? I thought maybe they had marital problems or something like that happened. And then they began to tell me this really bizarre story, and he did all the talking. He says, my wife is being attacked by a demonic spirit. I go, oh really? Okay, well, tell me about it. Well, she's been attacked in our house. There's a demonic presence there, and the demon has scratched her and burned her. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah. And then she proceeded to show me these scratches and burns. And I'm thinking, oh wow. So, and this happens at your house. They said, yeah, we believe there's a demon in our house. And then I said, well, this is why we do house blessings. And so I'll come and do a house blessing, and that should cleanse the house of the demon. In my mind, I'm skeptical, but I feel like I'm going to go along with this. Maybe this will help. So then I went to their house, and I did a total house blessing. And a house blessing really is an exorcism. Did you know that? It's cleansing the house of all evil spirits that might have been lingering around. And they were greatly relieved that I did that. I saw nothing supernatural at their house. I just did the blessing, prayed with them, and they seemed to be comforted. And I thought, well, okay, I did my job. And then I left. And then a couple of days later, 2 or 3 days later, I get a desperate call from the husband. And he says, Father, the demon's back. He's attacking my wife. And then I said to him, I said his name, I said, this is getting beyond my expertise and my ability to do this. And I'm thinking that I can inquire and see if there is a psychiatrist or psychologist that would have people of faith that would understand how to deal with this. And because perhaps this is something that needs to be dealt with someone who is proficient in the area of psychotherapy and all that kind of stuff. So blah, 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 I tell him. See, I'm a skeptic of this. And then he says, what do you mean, Father? What are you saying? You're saying that we have to go to a psychiatrist? If the demon's attacking her, aren't you the guy to be able to deal with that? and I said to him, well, so-and-so, those wounds on your wife could have been self-inflicted. You don't even believe that this is happening. You don't. And he got angry with me, rightfully so, I suppose. And we hung up at the phone, and of course, I never saw them again. But I felt badly about that, because I felt, did I fail them in some way? Did I not take this seriously enough? So I decided that I would do some research on modern experiences with exorcism. So the first book I read was written by M. Scott Peck, People of the Lie. And in there, you know that one, Father Richard. He gives an example of someone who, he's a psychiatrist, and when Scott Peck wrote The Road Less Traveled, remember that was a big book? His second book was People of the Lie. He was an agnostic psychiatrist. He was a scientist. And he was well known to the United States government because he was on the panel of psychiatrists that did an investigation of the My Lai massacre. An interview. The My Lai massacre happened in Vietnam when those American soldiers just went in and just completely shot every man, woman, and child in the village. It was a real scandalous thing that happened. And so the government did an investigation, and M. Scott Peck was the head of the psychiatric team that interviewed the troops that were engaged in what was called group evil and this atrocity. So he wrote the book People of the Lie, in which he gives an account of participating in an exorcism. And M. Scott Peck came to believe that there is something that's beyond any known psychiatric disorder. You could not could not diagnose them with a psychiatric disorder, and so he witnessed an exorcism. So here's this guy who became convinced of this reality. He later wrote a book that was published
Posthumously.
Thank you. Say that again really loud. Posthumously.
Posthumously.
Yeah, thank you, Polly. And the book is a detailed description of the case studies that he did dealing with an exorcism. He played the role of the psychiatrist, and he worked with a Roman Catholic priest. So he tells these stories, and I can see why it was published posthumously, but it was a stunning book, and I began to read other books about this from what I thought. I read a lot of creepy books that were just, you know, junk, and then I read some people who were serious. So I came to believe, to recognize, you know what? I don't know about my former members of my church, but they certainly believed something demonic was happening, and I want to be prepared the next time a member of my parish says, we need an exorcism, I'm going to do my job as a priest. You know, I'm just going to do it. Yeah, Adelia.
Well, I've had a lot of experience working with spirits that shouldn't be around because of the work that I do in the tribe.
Yeah.
And we get calls. I get calls from people. Over the years, probably maybe 12 different experiences I've had. Many of them were very benign, but there was a couple that were really troublesome and had to really be strong. And I was trained for this, so I never call myself an exorcist. I just say, you know, they call me, they say there's something going on in my house. The most profound experience I had really was a woman who was suffering. She could not go to work, and she lived in Silverado Canyon. And I went there, you know, and what I do is I start at the front door, and I bring the sage and all of that, but I also do singing, spiritual singing, you know, because sometimes certain spirits have different kind of hearing. So, but literally, when I was downstairs, their house was built, the bottom part was built in the earth. So there was no windows, it was just dirt. And when I was down there, one of the cabinets just flew open, and I got, you showing yourself. And so I started to sing.
Yeah.
That thing just took off so fast. It didn't possess anybody, but it was affecting the people in the house. There was some other things that I corrected because I noticed that she had a lot of owl feathers. In our tradition, owl feathers can really cause trouble if you don't know about the medicine that they can do, you know, or not the medicine, but the way that they do. So I had her wrap all those owl feathers and put them away in a way to stop their energy. And so there was a lot of things that needed to be done. But within a month, she had a job, she was smiling, her niece came back because she stayed in that room downstairs, and it was like something different had happened. But that was probably that thing opening up so fast, and then, you know, well, it makes it easier when they show themselves in a way, or they do something, because then you know where they are. But I do believe that there are those spirits that, and a lot of them just want to be told, go home, go. You know, they're confused or something, and you just tell them to go, you know, go to heaven, or go whatever, however you want to say it.
Yeah.
They just need somebody to tell them to do that.
Go into that herd of pigs.
Right, you know, or whatever. So,
Well,
but it's fascinating dealing with that.
Well, and I do think that people with traditional native cultures are more aware of this kind of phenomenon. We live in this post-enlightenment era, and I think we blind ourselves to some of these spiritual realities.
Oh, and
Well-
our ancestors played around with some really bad things. I don't go to Bolsa Chica to this day because that whole area there was a clan that just dealt in the dark. And so I stay away from there. But I could tell you stories about that.
So there's something to it. Not every story is, yes, Liz.
Well, it's a whole specialty, like a medical specialty. I mean, there's serious conferences out there.
Oh.
The Roman Catholic, in the Roman Catholic priests, and they are trained specialists.
Yeah.
You know, so it's a specialty, like a medical specialty.
Well, and actually the Roman Catholic Church has been doing this for a long time. After this experience, I said, I'm going to be prepared if it would ever happen again, and I'm going to do my job the best I can. And so then I read all these books, I studied up on it, and I realized, okay, there's more to this than I had originally thought. I wasn't going to be so skeptical and dismissive. But one of the things I learned in my reading is that we don't really know what demonic spirits are. We don't know what produces them or that. There is the tradition that they're fallen angels, whatever that means. But they are entities. And some of them are pretty weak and stupid, you know. And some of them are very vile and very corrupting and very powerful. So there's different kinds. I learned this in my research. But they're opportunists. A demonic spirit is looking for a way to attach themselves to the human psyche. And it can happen without you even being aware of it. So another thing I learned from reading this material is that they attack the most vulnerable because they're looking for an opportunity, and they and I don't know how they knew this, but I read this from Father Francis McNutt, the Dominican priest who did a study on this, and he said that the unborn child is vulnerable, and so a demonic spirit can be known to cause miscarriages. I thought, you're a smart guy. Why are you saying something that's kind of... But anyway, I remembered that. Okay. Years later, there's this couple in our church who have been trying to have children. They've been married for a few years. They're ready to start a family. It's what they really wanted to do. And they had the hardest time getting pregnant. They couldn't get pregnant. And the doctors didn't know why, because he was perfectly normal, she was perfectly normal, she was unable to conceive. And so, then they came to me to ask me, because they were Catholic, can we, in good conscience, use artificial, where they would take an egg from her and sperm from him and in a petri dish and then get fertilized eggs and plant them in her womb. And because I think the Roman Catholic Church is opposed to that. But I just thought there's nothing wrong with trying to create life. So if this works, enables you to have children, I think that's a wonderful thing. So they went ahead and did this, but every time they did it and they had planted in her womb a fertilized egg, or they would have a couple fertilized eggs, she would always lose them to a miscarriage. Then finally, she conceived through this means, and they planted in her womb 2 eggs, and it was a boy and a girl, and she didn't lose them. They got to where, in their development, they were a week before they could be viable outside the womb. There's a certain critical moment. She went into uncontrollable labor. I got a call from the hospital. I couldn't get there in time. Father Arturo went over there, and the babies were born, and they died after birth because they couldn't survive outside the womb, and there was nothing that medical technology could do for it. It was over here at UCI. I went in there, and they were devastated. And I saw the father holding his 2 twin children. Emily and Ethan were their name, and in his arms as they slowly died in his arms. We did a full funeral for the 2 children and all of that, and they were just destroyed. And so in the weeks after they lost their 2 children, I would go, every few days I would stop by just to visit how you're doing and all that. Because what I do, you follow it. Well, one time I was over there, I was sitting with the mother, and she was just grief-stricken, and she just says, I don't know, Father Peter, I just think there's a curse on me. And that struck me. And I remember what I read from Francis McNutt. There's no medical explanation for this. They should be able to produce children. This keeps happening to them. I wonder, Well, I didn't say anything to her there because I didn't want to sound weird. So I called her husband and said, come down and see me. And then I said to him, you know, you may think I'm crazy, but I have to tell you this, because if I don't, I would be remiss as your pastor. So I told him what I learned about exorcism and demonic spirits. And I said, you can talk it over with your wife, and if you want, we can prepare, I can do an exorcism. See, you know, if that would be okay. I don't want to add more grief and confusion to you and your wife, because I know you're in a very vulnerable place. An hour after he left, I get a phone call in my office and says, yeah, we want you to do this. So what I did is Francis McNutt put out an investigation where you have a questionnaire and you have both of them fill it out. So that if there was anything in their past that could be an indication of when she became or he became vulnerable to demonic spirit. Francis McNutt has worked this out to be kind of like a science. So then I administered testing for them, and something emerged. When the wife was a teenager, she played with the Ouija board. Now, playing with the Ouija board doesn't mean necessarily you're automatically going to have a demon. But this is what her experience was. She says, we would do this in parties, it was a game, and then one time I was just doing it by myself in my room, and I got really addicted to it. And then she said, one time I lifted my hands and the cursor started moving madly across the board by itself. And she says it scared her. She just threw out the Ouija board and did nothing about it. According to Francis McNutt, that could have been the opening, the opportunity that a demonic spirit had to enter into her psyche somehow, however that is. But there was no evidence that she had an evil spirit. It wasn't like she was weird or anything like that. It was not until 20 years later, she's trying to have children, that she's having this problem. So I said, well, this could be a possibility. We'll do the exorcism. So I got a team together. You don't want to do an exorcism just by yourself. So I had a team of people, and we did the whole exorcism right there in their home. We blessed her house. We did deliverance for her. It's just a ritual prayer. There was no manifestation. There was no twisting of heads and weird looks on her face or strange voices. But we just did it and saying, this has got to work. And we took it very seriously. And then afterwards, I asked, well, how do you feel? And they both said, we just feel so much at peace. So at least they were comforted. I thought, well, at least we did that. This was near October 4th that we did this, St. Francis Day. Within her next cycle, it was the first Sunday of Advent. They were in the church, and they had smiles on their faces, and they said, Father Peter, we have something to tell you. I said, what's that? We're pregnant. Within the first woman's cycle, she got pregnant right away after we did the exorcism, and she carried the child and gave birth to that child. And she could never naturally conceive. And immediately the difference was there. So all I can say is, do I know for sure there was a demon doing all this stuff? Well, no, I can't say that. But it makes me suspicious that they went through this whole ordeal, and then I say, let's do this exorcism, and immediately she conceives and gives birth to a child. It's like a miracle baby. And one of the prayer team that went with me was Candy Pouget.
Oh, man.
Remember Candy?
Oh, yeah.
We did it together. She was great. And ever since then, Candy and I just look at each other and go, wow. And when that baby was born, Candy and I would look at each other and go, oh my gosh. You know? So it's mysterious stuff. And it's not like you can test it in a laboratory, but it was rather suspicious circumstances. Anyway, I did all that. I got so far from the text, and I'm sorry about that, but maybe that's useful to you to try to imagine what the demonization is about. So, here's the miracle that Jesus performs. Verse 21. Then they came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath day, he entered the synagogue and taught. Remember, pay attention, it's a Sabbath day. He was teaching as one having authority, and then there is the demon who cries out. Verse 25, Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him with a very loud cry and came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this?" A teaching with authority. He commands even unclean spirits, and they obey him. His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. It's still the Sabbath. They go to Peter's house. By the way, if you go to Capernaum today, the foundation of Peter's house is there, right, Liz? You can see it. And they know it's Peter's house because there is a first century engraving on one of the stones, the house of Peter. Yeah, it's really there. So you can go there and see it. And it's just like across the parking lot was the synagogue. This distance, here would be Peter's house. It's real close. You can walk from the synagogue over to Peter's house. And then, so after they leave the synagogue, it was quite natural to go over to the house of Peter, Simon, Andrew, with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told him about her. Now, I always like pointing this out because Simon, the first pope, had a wife. You can't have a mother-in-law unless you have a wife. And we have an icon at the entrance of the church over there of Peter. Have you ever noticed it at the entrance on the other side? Peter, and guess who the woman is standing next to him? Peter and his wife. Okay, verse 31. He approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up, and then the fever left her, and she waited on them. Remember, this is the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do any work. She's healed, and she's happy to do work on the Sabbath. This will become a theme, because this will become the opening for the critics of Jesus. You can't work on the Sabbath. Okay, then, when it was evening after sunset, they brought to him all who were ill and possessed by demons. The whole town was gathered at the door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons, not permitting them to speak, because they knew him. We're coming to the end of our time, but I want to bring something here to your attention. Binding the strong man, remember that? Below there is the Messianic secret. You see that? This is, for the most part, unique to Mark. Because, and I give all the scripture verses, whenever Jesus many times performed an exorcism, whenever he performed an exorcism, he told the demons to shut up. Even though they were saying great things about him. "Oh, you're the Holy One of God, blah, blah, blah." Shut up. Also, when he performed healings, he would tell people, "Don't tell anybody." And then when he had the Mount of Transfiguration in Mark's Gospel, when they're coming down from the mountain, he says to Peter, James, and John, "Don't tell anybody." And it's unusual because the disciples, or the people being healed by Jesus in Mark's Gospel, are always being told, "Don't tell anybody." Isn't that peculiar? And I have no idea why he does that. But Diane today was talking to me about this very thing, and she said, notice that whenever he commands people, other than demons, but the people who were healed, don't tell anybody, what do? They tell everybody. Then, in the resurrection story, when the women are told in Mark's Gospel by the young man in the tomb, "Go tell the disciples." Go tell. Now this time you're not supposed to keep it secret. Go out and tell people. They were afraid and didn't tell anybody. So when they were told not to tell anybody, they broadcast it. And then when they were told to tell somebody, they couldn't do it. So, anyway, this is our, where we'll stop off tonight and we'll continue on next week in our study. Okay, everybody. Let us form our prayer circle. Some of you won't be able to come every week, but the Bible studies will be on YouTube. and you can tune in so you can keep up when you can't come.
You can reach it through the St. Matthew Facebook page.
Yeah, that's where you'll post them. Thank you so much, Jim, for doing this. Any intentions you want to offer as we pray together?
Just pray for the families and the victims of the earthquake in Mexico.
Yeah, 2 all 4.
And also the people suffering from, in Puerto Rico from
Maria.
Maria.
Wow.
A lot of natural disasters going on right
Let's hold all of these victims of natural disasters in our hearts as our intention as we offer this prayer. Father in heaven, we are so grateful for all the gifts that you give to us and the great promise of deliverance that you've offered us through your Son, Jesus. We pray for all those who are suffering from these natural disasters and any person who is suffering loss or deprivation or injury. We ask for your saving grace and comfort as we pray now in the words that your Son Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be,